The tears streaming down Grace Nelson's face caught the golden rays of the setting Montana sun. As she stood alone on the wooden platform of Bozeman's train depot, her slender shoulders shaking with each sob. Her once pristine blue traveling dress now bore the dust of a journey that had led only to heartbreak. Behind her, the man who had sent for her as his bride was already walking away, his promise of marriage withdrawn upon seeing that she wasn't the beauty her photograph had suggested. April 1878 had seemed to hold such promise when Grace had first answered the advertisement in the Boston newspaper. Prosperous rancher seeks genteel Eastern lady for matrimony and companionship. Now, just 2 weeks into her new life in the West, that promise had shattered like fine china dropped on hardwood floors. Deceiving a man is no way to start a marriage, Thomas Keller had said flatly after meeting her at the station earlier that day. His eyes had coldly assessed her plain features, her slight limp from a childhood illness, things the photograph hadn't revealed. "I'll arrange for your return ticket. The eastbound train leaves tomorrow." As the depot slowly emptied of travelers and workers, Grace struggled to compose herself. She had sold everything she owned to come west. There was no home to return to, no family waiting. Her parents had died in a fever outbreak 3 winters ago, leaving her with nothing but memories and debt. "Madam, depot's closing soon." Grace wiped her eyes with a handkerchief and looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the sunset. As he stepped closer, she could make out his features' sun-bronzed skin, dark hair beneath a well-worn hat, and eyes the color of a summer storm. His clothes were dusty, his boots scuffed, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he stood. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know where to go." The man nodded slightly, his gaze moving to the trunk beside her, then back to her tear-streaked face. "You're the mail-order bride for Thomas Keller," he stated rather than asked. Grace nodded, shame coloring her cheeks. "He's decided I'm not suitable after all." The stranger's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's Keller's way. Not the first time he's done this." A fresh wave of tears threatened, and Grace turned away, unable to bear another moment of humiliation. She heard the man's boots on the wooden planks as he moved closer, then felt the weight of his hand as it grasped the handle of her trunk. "Name's Vincent O'Malley," he said, lifting the heavy trunk as though it weighed nothing. "Got a small spread outside town." Grace blinked in confusion. "Mr. O'Malley," he cut her off with a single word, spoken so softly she almost didn't hear it. "Stay." The unexpected kindness in that one word nearly undid her completely. When she didn't respond, Vincent continued, "Got a room above the general store you can have tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure things out, no strings." "Why would you help me?" Grace asked, suspicion threading through her gratitude. Vincent's eyes met hers directly. "Because Keller's a fool and decent folks don't leave people stranded." He paused. "And because I've been stranded before." Something in his steady gaze told Grace he wasn't a man who made offers lightly. With nowhere else to turn and night approaching, she nodded her acceptance. "Thank you, Mr. O'Malley." "Vincent," he corrected, beginning to walk with her trunk. "Or Vince. Nobody calls me Mr. except the bank manager." As Grace followed him away from the depot and toward the dusty main street of Bozeman, she had no way of knowing that this moment of kindness would change the course of her life forever. The room above Holden's general store was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair beside the window that overlooked Main Street. Vincent had spoken briefly with Mrs. Holden, a plump, cheerful woman whose eyes had widened slightly at Grace's tear-stained face before quickly recovering her composure. "Dinner's at 6 sharp," Mrs. Holden had said, pressing a folded towel into Grace's hands. "Don't you worry about a thing, dear. That Thomas Keller hasn't kept a bride yet, it's him that's broken, not you." Now alone, Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, exhaustion washing over her. She'd traveled over 2,000 miles to marry a man who'd rejected her within minutes of meeting her. All her careful plans, her dreams of a new beginning, lay in ruins around her like the scattered contents of her trunk. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. "Miss Nelson." It was Vincent's voice. "Mrs. Holden sent up some hot water for washing." Grace opened the door to find him balancing a steaming pitcher in one hand, her trunk in the other. Setting down the pitcher, he carefully placed the trunk at the foot of her bed. "I'll leave you to rest," he said, backing toward the door. "If you're feeling up to it, there's dinner downstairs. If not, Mrs. Holden can bring something up." "Mr. O'Malley, Vincent," Grace corrected herself. "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head. "No need, get some rest." After he left, Grace unpacked only what she needed for the night. The rest she left in her trunk, no point in settling in when tomorrow might see her on a train back east. To what? She wasn't sure. But the world felt slightly less frightening knowing there was at least one kind soul in Bozeman. Downstairs, the Holden's dining room was warmly lit and filled with the aroma of roasting meat and freshly baked bread. 3 other boarders were already seated: an elderly schoolteacher, a young clerk from the bank, and a traveling salesman. Mrs. Holden introduced Grace as a friend from back east, with no mention of her unfortunate situation, for which Grace was immensely grateful. Vincent arrived just as Mrs. Holden began serving, his hair damp from washing and his clothes changed for cleaner ones. He nodded to Grace, but took a seat beside the bank clerk, engaging him in quiet conversation about cattle prices. Throughout the meal, Grace felt Vincent's eyes on her occasionally, though whenever she looked his way, he was focused on his food or in conversation with the others. There was something about him that intrigued her, a quietness that suggested depth rather than simplicity. "Mr. O'Malley's got the best horse stock this side of the mountains," Mrs. Holden told Grace as she served apple pie for dessert. "Started with next to nothing 5 years ago. Now the army buys his horses regular." "Just lucky," Vincent murmured, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Luck and 18 hours of work a day," Mr. Holden countered. "Don't let him fool you, Miss Nelson. Nobody works harder than Vince O'Malley." After dinner, as the other boarders dispersed to their rooms or the parlor, Vincent approached Grace. "Thought I'd check if you need anything before I head back to my place." "You don't stay here?" Grace asked. "No, got a room at the livery stable when I'm in town. Most nights I'm out at my place." He hesitated. About tomorrow, Grace steeled herself. "Yes, the eastbound train. What time does it depart?" Vincent frowned. "That's not what I was going to say." He glanced around the dining room, then gestured toward the small porch at the back of the house. "Mind stepping outside a moment?" The April evening was cool, with a breeze carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, more stars than Grace had ever seen in Boston. Vincent leaned against the porch railing, his profile illuminated by the light spilling from the house windows. "I've been thinking," he began, "about your situation." "It's not your concern," Grace said, though there was no bite in her words. "You've already done more than most would." "I need help," he said abruptly. "At my ranch. Been looking to hire someone to cook and keep house. The pay's not much, but there's a cabin you could stay in. Just until you decide what you want to do." Grace stared at him, caught between suspicion and desperate hope. "Why would you offer that to a complete stranger?" Vincent looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Like I said, I need the help, and—" He paused, seemingly struggling with his words. "And I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." There was a story there, Grace sensed, one he wasn't ready to share, but his eyes, when they met hers again, held nothing but honest intent. "It wouldn't be proper," she said softly. "A single woman living on your property, the cabin's a quarter-mile from the main house," he interrupted. "And Mrs. Holden's niece, Sarah, helps out there sometimes. She could chaperone if folks talk," he straightened. "It's just work, Miss Nelson. Nothing more." Grace considered her options, which were few. Return east with empty pockets and a heavier heart, or accept this unexpected offer and buy herself some time. "I'm not much of a cook," she admitted. The corner of Vincent's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Can you boil coffee without burning it?" "Yes." "Then you're already better than me." This time the smile appeared fully, transforming his serious face. "Think on it tonight. I'll come by in the morning." As Vincent took his leave, Grace remained on the porch, watching as he walked toward the livery stable, his long strides eating up the distance. Everything in her upbringing told her to refuse his offer. Everything in her heart told her to accept. That night, as Grace lay in the narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town settling into darkness, she made her decision. She would accept Vincent O'Malley's offer not forever, just long enough to save some money and form a new plan. This wasn't the life she'd journeyed west to find, but perhaps it was the one she needed. Morning came with a clarity Grace hadn't felt since leaving Boston. She dressed carefully in her simplest dress, a practical brown cotton with white collar and cuffs, and pinned her chestnut hair into a neat bun. If she was to be a housekeeper, she would look the part. Mrs. Holden met her at the breakfast table with a sympathetic smile. "Vincent told me about his offer," she said, pouring coffee. "He's a good man, Miss Nelson. Keeps to himself mostly, but there's not a soul in the county who'd say otherwise." "I barely know him," Grace replied, spreading butter on a warm biscuit. "That's true enough. But I've known him 5 years, and I'd trust him with my life." Mrs. Holden sat across from her. "My niece Sarah helps out at his place twice a week. She says he works from sunup to sundown, barely stops to eat unless someone puts food in front of him." She patted Grace's hand. "The cabin's nice, too. Used to be his until he built the main house last year." The information eased some of Grace's concerns. If Mrs. Holden approved of the arrangement, perhaps it wasn't so improper after all. Vincent arrived shortly after breakfast, driving a wagon loaded with supplies. He'd shaved, Grace noted, and wore a clean flannel shirt tucked into faded denim pants. His hat was pushed back slightly, revealing more of his face than she'd seen the day before. "Morning," he greeted, nodding to both women. "Miss Nelson, have you decided?" Grace squared her shoulders. "I have. I accept your offer, Mr. O'Malley, with gratitude." Something that might have been relief flickered across his features. "Good. We should get going then. It's about an hour's drive to the ranch." As Vincent loaded her trunk into the wagon, Mrs. Holden pressed a package into Grace's hands. "Some food for today," she explained. "And a few other things you might need." Grace hugged the older woman, surprised by how much she'd come to like her in such a short time. "Thank you for everything." "You'll come to town with Vincent on Saturdays," Mrs. Holden said. "We'll have tea together." The promise of future friendship warmed Grace as Vincent helped her climb onto the wagon seat. As they pulled away from the general store, she caught sight of a familiar figure watching from across the street, Thomas Keller, his face darkening as he recognized her companion. "Ignore him," Vincent said quietly, noticing her expression. "Keller's all talk." They left Bozeman behind, the wagon following a well-worn trail that wound through rolling grasslands dotted with sagebrush. In the distance, the Bridger Mountains rose in stark beauty against the blue sky. Spring was just beginning to touch the landscape, with tender green shoots appearing among the winter-bleached grasses. "It's beautiful," Grace said, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between them. Vincent nodded. "Different from the East, I imagine." "Very, so much. Space." She gestured to the open country surrounding them. "In Boston, buildings press in close, streets narrow and crowded. Here, it feels like you can breathe." "That's why I came," Vincent admitted. "Needed breathing room." "Where are you from originally?" Grace asked. "Philadelphia." "Worked in my father's shipping business until the war." His tone discouraged further questions about that time, so Grace changed the subject. "Tell me about your ranch." The tension in Vincent's shoulders eased as he described his property, 160 acres under the Homestead Act, with additional grazing rights on adjoining public land. He'd started with just 4 horses, carefully chosen for their bloodlines and temperament, and now had a herd of 30 with new foals expected soon. "Army contracts keep us afloat," he explained. "They need good horses for the cavalry. But I'm starting to breed some finer stock 2-carriage horses for the wealthy folks back east." "Us?" Grace queried. "Me and Hank Morrison, my ranch hand. He's a good man, bit rough around the edges, lives in the bunkhouse." Vincent glanced at her. "Sarah comes Tuesdays and Fridays to help with washing and such. Rest of the time, it's just been me burning food and living like a bachelor." Grace smiled at the image. "Well, I may not be a gourmet cook, but I promise not to burn the food much." Vincent's laugh surprised her, rich and genuine, transforming his solemn face. "I'll hold you to that." The ranch came into view as they crested a neat collection of buildings nestled in a small valley with a creek running through it. The main house was modest but solidly built of logs with a stone chimney. Nearby stood a large barn, a smaller bunkhouse, and what must be the cabin Vincent had mentioned, set apart from the other buildings beneath 2 tall cottonwood trees. As they approached, a wiry man with graying hair emerged from the barn, followed by a black and white dog that bounded toward the wagon with excited barks. "That's Hank," Vincent said, "and the welcoming committee is Scout." The dog reached them first, running circles around the wagon until Vincent called him to heel. Hank Morrison approached more sedately, eyeing Grace with undisguised curiosity. "Miss Nelson, this is Hank Morrison. Hank, this is Grace Nelson. She'll be keeping house for us." Hank removed his hat, revealing a shock of gray hair and a weathered face that had seen its share of sun and hardship. "Pleasure, madam. About time we got some civilizing influence around here." "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Morrison," Grace replied, accepting Vincent's help down from the wagon. "Just Hank, madam. Nobody's called me Mr. in 30 years. Vincent unloaded Grace's trunk from the wagon. "I'll show Miss Nelson to the cabin, then take care of the team." The cabin proved to be far more comfortable than Grace had expected. Though small, with just one main room and a lean-to addition at the back, it was clean and solidly built. A bed with a patchwork quilt stood in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs in another. The lean-to housed a washstand and space for storage. A pot-bellied stove provided heat, and windows on 3 sides let in ample light. "It's not much," Vincent said, setting her trunk beside the bed, "but it's dry and warm." "It's perfect," Grace replied honestly. After the crowded tenements of Boston, this small, private space felt like luxury. Vincent pointed out various features: the woodpile stacked neatly behind the cabin, the path to the creek where she could draw water, the outhouse discreetly located behind a stand of wild plum trees. "Main house has the kitchen," he explained. "Figured you'd cook there and take your meals with us if that suits you, unless you prefer privacy." "I'm happy to join you," Grace assured him. "I've had enough solitude these past few years." Vincent nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll let you get settled then. Dinner's usually around sundown, but today, whenever you're ready is fine." Left alone, Grace unpacked her meager possessions, 3 dresses besides the one she wore, undergarments, a nightgown, a few books, her parents' photographs, and her mother's silver hairbrush. She changed into her oldest dress, suitable for housework, and decided to familiarize herself with the kitchen before attempting to cook dinner. The main house was simple, but built with care. The large central room combined kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. 2 doors led to what Grace presumed were bedrooms. The kitchen portion contained a large cast iron cookstove, a dry sink, and open shelves holding mismatched dishes and cookware. Grace inspected the pantry, making mental notes of supplies and what might be needed. The organization or lack thereof told her Vincent had been living primarily on coffee, bacon, beans, and whatever game he hunted. A sack of potatoes, looking somewhat neglected, sat in a corner. She was examining the stove when Vincent returned from the barn. "Hope you don't mind me exploring," she said. "It's your kitchen now." He glanced around as if seeing the space through new eyes. "Probably not what you're used to." "Actually, it's a fine kitchen, just needs organizing." Grace opened the stove to check the firebox. "I could cook something simple for dinner tonight if you'd like." Vincent nodded. "That would be welcome. I'll bring in more water for you." As Vincent went to fetch water, Grace sorted through the pantry supplies. She found enough to make a decent meal: bacon, potatoes, dried beans that had been soaking, and cornmeal for bread. Not fancy, but filling and familiar. By the time Vincent returned with water buckets, Grace had the stove fired up and potatoes peeled. He watched her work for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Need to check on a mare about to foal. Hank's bringing in some firewood for you." "Take your time," Grace replied, already feeling more comfortable in this new role than she'd expected. "Dinner won't be ready for a while yet." As Vincent left, Grace caught herself humming softly, a habit from her childhood that had fallen away during the difficult years after her parents' deaths. Something about this place, despite its remoteness and her uncertain future, eased a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The sun was setting when Vincent and Hank came in for dinner, both men washing up at the pump outside before entering the house. The kitchen was warm and filled with the aroma of bacon and cornbread. Grace had set the table with the best of the mismatched dishes she'd found and was slicing the cornbread when they entered. "Something smells mighty fine," Hank declared, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Vincent sniffed appreciatively. "Beats burnt coffee and hardtack." Grace gestured toward the table. "It's nothing special. Just bacon, beans, and potatoes with cornbread." "Looks like a feast to me," Vincent said, seating himself at the table. The meal passed pleasantly, with Hank carrying most of the conversation. He told stories of his years working cattle drives and his brief, ill-fated attempt at prospecting before meeting Vincent in Helena 3 years ago. "Boss man here found me flat broke and offered me work," Hank explained. "Been here ever since." "The horses needed tending and you needed a job," Vincent said simply. "Worked out for both of us." Grace observed the easy camaraderie between the 2 men, noting how Vincent relaxed in Hank's company. With her, he remained somewhat guarded, though unfailingly polite. After dinner, Hank insisted on helping with the dishes, declaring it only fair since Grace had cooked. Vincent excused himself to make a final check on the mare, leaving Grace and Hank to clean up. "He's a good man," Hank said as he dried a plate. "Best I've worked for." "I'm beginning to see that," Grace replied. Hank studied her for a moment. "Don't know your story, miss, and won't ask, but if you're running from something, you've landed in a safe place." Grace paused in her washing. I'm not running, not exactly, just starting over. Hank nodded. Ain't we all in one way or another? When Vincent returned, he found Grace sitting at the table with a pencil and paper making lists. He raised an eyebrow in question. Just organizing what supplies we might need from town, she explained. The pantry needs restocking if I'm to cook proper meals. Vincent pulled up a chair across from her. Make your list. I'll be heading to Bozeman on Saturday. Thank you. Grace hesitated, then asked, What are your preferences for meals? I should know what you enjoy. Not picky, Vincent replied, though I admit a fondness for apple pie. Apple pie, Grace repeated, adding it to her list with a smile. I can manage that. They discussed household matters for a while longer, laundry schedules, cooking arrangements, the condition of various supplies. It was all very practical, yet Grace found herself enjoying the simple domesticity of the conversation. As the evening grew late, Vincent rose from the table. Better get some rest. Morning comes early around here. What time should I have breakfast ready? We're usually up before dawn. But don't feel you need to keep our hours right away. Must be tired from your journey still. Grace stood as well. I'll be up. It's what you're paying me for, after all. Vincent walked her to the door. The night air was cool, the sky ablaze with stars. Scout, who had been sleeping by the fireplace, accompanied them, trotting ahead toward the cabin. Looks like you've got an escort, Vincent observed. Will he stay with me? Grace asked, surprised. If you want the company. He usually sleeps in the barn, but he's taken a shine to you. Grace smiled down at the dog. I wouldn't mind the company tonight. They walked in silence to the cabin, Scout leading the way. At the door, Vincent paused. If you need anything in the night, the main house is just a shout away. I'll be fine, Grace assured him. Thank you again, Vincent. For everything, he nodded, his expression softening in the moonlight. Sleep well, Grace. As she watched him walk back to the main house, Grace felt a curious mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. Whatever the future held, she was beginning to think that perhaps fate had been kind in bringing her to Vincent O'Malley's door. The next few days fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Grace rose early each morning to prepare breakfast for Vincent and Hank before they headed out to work with the horses. She spent her days cleaning the main house, organizing the kitchen, and planning meals. In the afternoons, she often walked the property, sometimes with Scout as her companion, learning the lay of the land. Vincent proved to be a fair employer, never demanding more than she could reasonably manage and expressing genuine appreciation for her efforts. Their conversations, initially limited to household matters, gradually expanded to include her observations about the ranch and his plans for expanding his horse breeding program. On Friday, Sarah Holden arrived, a cheerful young woman of perhaps 16 who immediately took to Grace. Aunt Martha told me all about you, Sarah confided as they worked together on the laundry. Said you were meant for better than Thomas Keller anyway. Grace smiled at the girl's forthright manner. Your aunt was very kind to me. She likes Vincent too, Sarah continued, wringing out a shirt with practiced efficiency. Says he's the most honorable man in the territory, just too quiet for his own good. He doesn't speak much of himself, Grace agreed. Sarah nodded knowingly. The war changed him, Aunt Martha says. He was a cavalry officer captain, I think. Came west after it ended. Didn't want to go back to Philadelphia. This new information about Vincent intrigued Grace, though she felt uncomfortable learning it secondhand rather than from the man himself. Still, it helped explain the sometimes haunted look she'd noticed in his eyes. Does he have family back east? She asked, trying to sound casual. Don't think so. Aunt Martha says he was engaged once, but his fiancée married someone else while he was fighting. Some politician's son who didn't serve. Sarah lowered her voice. Aunt Martha says that's why he doesn't trust easily, especially with women. Grace changed the subject, uncomfortable with gossiping about the man who had shown her such kindness. Still, she found herself watching Vincent more closely that evening, noticing the slight stiffness in his left shoulder when he reached for something. The way his eyes sometimes focused on something distant only he could see. Saturday brought their first trip to Bozeman together. Vincent loaded the wagon with several items for trade: a handcrafted saddle he'd completed, some leather goods, and a small crate of early vegetables from his kitchen garden that Grace hadn't even known existed. "The vegetables are Sarah's doing," he explained when Grace commented on them. "She started a garden last year, said I needed something green besides the grass." The ride to town was pleasant, with Vincent pointing out various landmarks and neighboring ranches along the way. Grace found him more talkative away from the ranch, as if the open country loosened something in him. "That ridge there," he said, gesturing to a distant formation, "marks the edge of Crow territory. They're peaceful enough these days, mostly keep to themselves. Their chief, Plenty Coops, is a wise man." "Have you met him?" Grace asked, fascinated. "A few times. Traded horses with him once." Vincent adjusted the reins slightly. "He said my horses had good spirits, highest compliment from a Crow." As they approached Bozeman, Grace felt a flutter of anxiety. What if they encountered Thomas Keller? The humiliation of their meeting was still fresh, despite the eventful days since. Vincent seemed to sense her unease. "We'll get our business done quickly. No need to linger if you're uncomfortable." "I'm fine," Grace insisted, straightening her shoulders. "I can't hide forever." Vincent smiled, a rare enough occurrence that it still caught her by surprise. "That's the spirit." The town was busy, with Saturday bringing in folks from outlying ranches and farms. Vincent stopped the wagon in front of Holden's general store, helping Grace down before beginning to unload their goods. "Go on in," he encouraged. "Mrs. Holden's expecting you for tea." "I'll take care of the supplies on your list." Inside, Mrs. Holden welcomed Grace with a warm embrace. "Look at you. A week in the country has put roses in your cheeks already." Grace laughed, realizing she did feel better, stronger, more alive than she had in years. "It's the fresh air and good food, I think. And perhaps the company," Mrs. Holden suggested with a knowing smile. "Vincent has been very kind," Grace replied carefully. "And Hank is a character." Mrs. Holden led her to the small apartment at the back of the store where she and Mr. Holden lived. The parlor was cozy, with a table already set for tea. "Now," Mrs. Holden said, pouring steaming tea into delicate cups that seemed out of place in the frontier town, "tell me everything." Grace described her week at the ranch, the work she'd been doing, and her growing ease with her new role. Mrs. Holden listened attentively, occasionally asking questions but mostly allowing Grace to talk freely. "And Vincent," she finally asked, "how are you finding him as an employer?" "Fair. Considerate, perhaps a bit reserved." Mrs. Holden nodded. "He carries burdens, that one. Lost a lot in the war, not just comrades, but faith in people, I think." "Sarah mentioned he was a captain," Grace said hesitantly. "Cavalry, yes. Fought at Gettysburg and other battles I can't recall. Came west with nothing but his horse and what he could carry." Mrs. Holden sighed. "Took him nearly a year before he'd join us for dinner. Preferred his own company." "He seems comfortable with Hank," Grace observed. "Hank's straightforward. What you see is what you get. Vincent appreciates that." Mrs. Holden refilled their cups. "And you, my dear, are you settling in?" Grace considered the question. "I am, surprisingly. It's not the life I imagined when I came west, but perhaps it's the life you needed," Mrs. Holden finished for her. "Sometimes fate has better plans than we do." When Vincent returned, having completed their errands, He suggested Grace might like to explore the town a bit before they headed back to the ranch. "There's a millinery shop down the street," he said, "and a bookstore just opened last month." Grace brightened at the mention of books. "I'd love to see the bookstore." They walked together down Main Street, drawing curious glances from townspeople who clearly recognized Vincent, but were surprised to see him in female company. Grace was acutely aware of his tall presence beside her, of the respectful nods he received from men they passed, and the speculative looks from women. The bookstore was small but well-stocked, with a selection that surprised Grace for a frontier town. While she browsed, Vincent spoke quietly with the proprietor, an elderly man with spectacles and an Eastern accent. Grace selected a volume of poetry by Longfellow and was about to bring it to the counter when Vincent appeared at her side. "Found something you like?" She showed him the book. "Longfellow has always been a favorite." Vincent nodded, then reached into his pocket and handed her several coins. "For the book, and anything else that catches your eye." "Oh, I couldn't consider it a welcome gift," he interrupted. "Everyone needs books." The simple gesture touched Grace deeply. Books had been her refuge during difficult times, her connection to worlds beyond her reach. That Vincent understood this about her, without her having to explain, created a new warmth in her heart. "Thank you," she said softly. "This means a great deal to me." Something flickered in Vincent's eyes, understanding perhaps, or a shared sentiment. Then it was gone, his expression returning to its usual calm. "Take your time," he said. "I'll wait outside." Grace added a second book to her purchase, a novel she'd been wanting to read. As the bookseller wrapped her selections in brown paper, he smiled kindly. "Mr. O'Malley's a good customer. Comes in whenever he's in town, always leaves with something thoughtful." Surprised to see him with a lady friend, though. "I'm his housekeeper," Grace clarified quickly. The old man's eyes twinkled. "Of course. My mistake." Outside, Vincent was waiting with the wagon already prepared for departure. As they climbed aboard, Grace noticed Thomas Keller standing outside the saloon across the street, watching them with an expression that could only be described as sour. Vincent saw him too. "Ignore him," he advised again, though his jaw tightened slightly. They were nearly out of town when a rider approached from behind, calling Vincent's name. He pulled the wagon to a stop as a young man in an army uniform drew alongside. "Lieutenant Davis," Vincent greeted him. "What brings you to Bozeman?" "Passing through on my way back to Fort Ellis," the lieutenant replied. His gaze shifted to Grace, curiosity evident. "Miss Grace Nelson, Lieutenant James Davis," Vincent introduced them. "Miss Nelson is keeping house at my ranch." The lieutenant tipped his hat. "Madam, pleasure." "Lieutenant Davis is stationed at Fort Ellis," Vincent explained to Grace. "The Army's been my best customer these past few years." "Speaking of which," Davis said, "the colonel sent me to ask if you'd consider another contract. We need 20 horses by fall." Vincent considered this. "20's a lot. Might have 15 ready by then, not more. 15 would be a start. Colonel says your horses outlast any others we've bought, worth the wait for quality." They discussed details for a few minutes longer before the lieutenant took his leave, promising to send official paperwork soon. As they continued toward the ranch, Grace sensed Vincent's satisfaction with the exchange. "That's good news, isn't it?" "The Army contract. Very good," he agreed. "Steady income, fair prices, and they treat the horses well, which matters to me." "You care about them a great deal," Grace observed. "The horses, I mean." Vincent was quiet for a moment. "During the war, my horse saved my life more than once." "Intelligence, loyalty, heart. A good horse has all those things." He glanced at her. "People think they're just animals, but they're more than that." It was perhaps the most personal thing he'd shared with her. and Grace treasured it as they traveled the remaining distance to the ranch in companionable silence. The following weeks brought a gradual shift in Grace's relationship with Vincent. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, though he still maintained a certain reserve. She learned to recognize his moods when he needed quiet, when he was open to company, when memories of the past darkened his thoughts. Spring advanced across the Montana landscape, bringing wildflowers to the grasslands and new foals to Vincent's herd. Grace found unexpected joy in watching the gangly newborns find their feet, in the changing seasons, in the rhythm of ranch life that began to feel like home. One evening in late May, as Grace prepared dinner, Vincent came in from the barn earlier than usual. "Everything all right?" she asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "Just finished a letter to the army," he replied, washing his hands at the sink. "They've offered to buy all 20 horses if I can have them ready by October." "That's wonderful," Grace exclaimed, genuinely pleased for him. "It's what you've been working toward, isn't it?" Vincent nodded, leaning against the counter. "It is. But it means more work than Hank and I can handle alone." He hesitated. "I'm considering hiring another hand." "That seems sensible," Grace said, returning to her cooking. "It would mean changes around here. Another person to feed, more activity." Grace glanced at him, suddenly understanding. "Are you concerned it would make more work for me?" "Partly," Vincent admitted. "But also, things have been good with just the three of us. Peaceful. I don't want to upset that balance." The acknowledgement that he valued the household they'd created together warmed Grace unexpectedly. "I can manage another mouth to feed," she assured him. "And if it helps the ranch succeed, that's what matters." Vincent studied her face. "You've settled in well here." "I have," Grace agreed softly. "More than I expected to." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, perhaps, of how their arrangement had evolved from one of necessity to something neither had anticipated. Then Hank burst through the door, breaking the moment. "Smells good in here. What's for supper?" Life at the ranch grew busier with the arrival of Ben Taylor. The new ranch hand Vincent hired, a young man barely 20, with a cheerful disposition and boundless energy. With another set of hands, work on training the horses for the Army contract progressed more quickly, and Vincent began to seem less burdened by the weight of responsibility. Grace found herself enjoying the expanded household. Ben brought youth and laughter to their meals, telling stories of his adventures working on cattle drives farther south. Even Vincent smiled more frequently, drawn out of his usual reserve by the young man's enthusiasm. June brought summer heat and longer days. Grace established a small garden near her cabin, growing herbs and flowers that added color to her modest home. On Sundays, when work slowed somewhat, she occasionally read aloud from her books after dinner, a practice that began when Ben mentioned missing his mother's readings back home. To her surprise, Vincent seemed to enjoy these sessions as much as the others, often lingering long after Hank and Ben had retired to the bunkhouse. Sometimes they would talk afterward about the story, at first, then gradually about more personal matters. One such evening in early July, as they sat on the porch of the main house watching fireflies rise from the grass, Vincent asked about her life before coming west. "What made you decide to become a mail-order bride?" The question was gentle, without judgment. Grace folded her hands in her lap, considering how much to share. "After my parents died, I worked as a seamstress in a shop that made wedding dresses," she began. "The irony wasn't lost on me, creating beautiful gowns for happy brides while my own prospects dwindled." Vincent listened silently, his profile illuminated by the last glow of sunset. The work was difficult, the pay barely enough to survive, and then the shop closed when the owner died. Grace sighed. I saw an advertisement in the newspaper. Prosperous rancher seeks genteel Eastern lady for matrimony and companionship. It seemed providential. Keller, Vincent said, the name like gravel in his mouth. Yes, we exchanged letters for several months. He seemed kind, educated, sent money for my passage. Grace's voice grew quieter. I knew I wasn't beautiful, but I hoped my other qualities would matter more. Vincent turned to look at her directly. Keller's a fool, he said, echoing his words from the day they'd met. But this time, there was something more in his voice, a conviction that made Grace's heart quicken. It worked out for the best, she said, trying to keep her tone light. I found a better situation. Vincent was silent for a long moment. Why haven't you asked about returning east? You must have saved enough by now. The question caught Grace off guard. It was true she had saved most of her wages, living simply in the cabin Vincent provided. Yet the thought of leaving had grown increasingly distant, like a dream from another life. I suppose I've found contentment here, she answered honestly. Boston holds painful memories. Here I feel useful, needed. Vincent nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. You are needed, Grace. More than you know. The words hung in the warm summer air between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Grace felt her cheeks warm and looked away toward the distant mountains now purple in the twilight. It's getting late, she said softly. I should get back to my cabin. Vincent stood, offering his hand to help her up. The brief contact sent a flutter through her chest that had become increasingly familiar whenever they touched, however innocently. I'll walk you, he said, as he did most evenings now. As they walked the short distance to her cabin, Grace was acutely aware of Vincent beside her, his steady presence, the slight scent of leather and horses that always accompanied him, the careful way he kept pace with her. At her door, they paused as they always did. Thank you for sharing your story, Vincent said. It can't have been easy. Somehow it's easier to talk about difficult things here, Grace replied. Perhaps it's the open spaces. Vincent smiled, one of his rare, genuine smiles that transformed his solemn features. Perhaps it's the company. Before Grace could respond, a shout came from the direction of the barn Ben's voice, urgent and alarmed. Vincent's expression immediately shifted to concern. Stay here, he said, already turning toward the sound. Grace ignored the instruction, following several paces behind as Vincent strode quickly to the barn. Inside, they found Ben struggling with a mare in obvious distress, her sides heaving, sweat darkening her coat. Colic, Vincent said grimly, moving immediately to the horse's side. How long has she been like this? Found her just now, Ben replied, his young face tight with worry. Came to check on that cut on Jupiter's leg and heard her thrashing. Vincent ran practiced hands over the mare's belly, his touch gentle despite the urgency. Need to keep her walking. Grace, can you fetch Hank from the bunkhouse? Grace hurried to comply, returning moments later with a sleep-rumpled Hank who took in the situation at a glance. Bad one? He asked Vincent, who nodded grimly. Might need the vet if we can't ease her soon. The next few hours passed in tense focus as the three men worked to save the horse, walking her continuously, administering remedies Vincent had on hand. Grace made coffee and brought it to the barn, then helped where she could holding lanterns, fetching clean water, offering encouragement. Dawn was breaking when the mare finally showed signs of improvement, her breathing easier, the wild look of pain in her eyes subsiding. Vincent, who had worked tirelessly through the night, leaned against a stall door in exhaustion. She'll make it, he said, relief evident in his voice. Ben, Hank, get some rest. I'll stay with her a while longer. The two men nodded gratefully and headed toward the bunkhouse. Grace hesitated, reluctant to leave Vincent alone after such an ordeal. You should rest too, she said gently. You've been up all night. Vincent shook his head. Need to make sure she's truly on the mend. Then I'll stay with you, Grace decided, pulling up a three-legged stool from the corner of the barn. Vincent looked as if he might protest, then simply nodded, his fatigue apparent in the slump of his shoulders. They sat in companionable silence as the mare dozed, her crisis past. Gradually, Vincent's tense posture relaxed. You handled that well, Grace observed. You must have seen many such cases. Too many, Vincent agreed. Lost some, saved others, never gets easier. You care deeply for them. Vincent's gaze remained on the sleeping horse. In the war, soldiers treated horses as equipment replaceable, expendable. I couldn't see them that way. Each one has a personality, a spirit. He paused. After Gettysburg, my horse, Thunder, carried me for miles despite a bullet wound in his shoulder. Saved my life. Least I can do is honor that debt with others of his kind. The story moved Grace deeply. What happened to Thunder? A shadow crossed Vincent's face. Died the following winter. Wound never fully healed. He was quiet for a moment. Buried him on a hill overlooking a valley in Virginia. Seemed right, he should have a view. Without thinking, Grace reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. Vincent looked up, surprised by the contact, but didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand to clasp hers gently. "Thank you," he said simply, "for staying." In that moment, something shifted between them, subtle yet profound. Grace felt it like a physical change in the air, as if the world had tilted slightly on its axis, realigning everything in new and unexpected ways. Later, as she finally returned to her cabin to change clothes before beginning the day's tasks, Grace acknowledged what she had been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with Vincent O'Malley. The realization should have frightened her, given her recent experience with Thomas Keller. Instead, it settled in her heart with a rightness that felt like coming home. The days that followed brought subtle changes to Grace and Vincent's interactions. Nothing was said explicitly, but there were moments, his hand lingering when he passed her something at dinner, their eyes meeting across a room, conversations that stretched later into the evening than before. Grace found herself paying more attention to her appearance, pinning a wildflower to her dress, arranging her hair with greater care. Hank noticed, of course. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing a chicken coop, he commented casually, "Boss seems happier these days." Grace concentrated on the nail she was hammering. "Does he? Mm." Hank's weathered face broke into a knowing smile. "Seems to find more reasons to be around the house than the barn lately." Heat rose in Grace's cheeks. "The Army contract keeps him busy. He needs good meals to keep up his strength." "Sure," Hank agreed amiably. "That must be it." July gave way to August, bringing thunderstorms that cooled the air temporarily before the heat returned with greater intensity. One particularly hot afternoon, Vincent suggested a picnic by the creek where a stand of cottonwoods provided shade. "Too hot for cooking indoors," he said when Grace looked surprised by the invitation. "Thought it might be pleasant by the water." So it was that Grace found herself preparing a simple meal of cold chicken, bread, and early apples to be enjoyed outdoors. Vincent brought a blanket to spread beneath the trees, and they sat in the dappled shade listening to the creek's gentle murmur. "This reminds me of picnics my family used to have when I was a child," Grace said, breaking the comfortable silence. "My father would bring a fishing pole, though he rarely caught anything." Vincent smiled. "My mother loved picnics too, would pack elaborate baskets with all sorts of delicacies." His expression grew distant. "She died when I was 15. Heart gave out suddenly." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly, touched that he was sharing more of his past with her. "It was a long time ago." Vincent stretched his long legs out before him. My father remarried a year later a much younger woman who had little use for a stepson, made it easier to enlist when the war came. And your father died while I was at Gettysburg, didn't learn of it until months later. Vincent's voice held old pain, long accepted but never fully healed. His new wife inherited everything. By the time I returned to Philadelphia, the shipping business had been sold and the house emptied of anything that mattered. So you came west, Grace said, understanding more clearly now why he had chosen this new beginning. Vincent nodded. Seemed as good a direction as any. Far from memories, far from people who knew me as the son of Harrison O'Malley, shipping magnate. Do you regret it, coming here? Vincent considered the question, his gaze moving over the landscape, the rolling grasslands, distant mountains, the small but thriving ranch he had built from nothing. No, he said finally, this place, it heals something in me. And now he stopped abruptly. Now, Grace prompted gently. Vincent turned to look at her directly, his gray eyes intense. Now there's you. The simple statement hung in the air between them, its meaning unmistakable. Grace's heart quickened, and she found herself unable to look away from his gaze. Vincent, she began, uncertain what to say but knowing something had to be acknowledged. He moved closer slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. When she remained still, he reached out to touch her cheek with calloused fingers, the gentleness of the gesture in stark contrast to the strength she knew those hands possessed. I never expected you, he said quietly. Never thought to find someone who would matter so much. Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. Nor I. After Thomas, I thought. Thomas Keller is the blindest fool in the territory, Vincent said with unexpected vehemence. But I'm grateful for his blindness. It brought you here. He leaned forward then, hesitantly, and when Grace didn't pull away, he kissed her a gentle, questioning kiss that asked, rather than demanded. Grace answered by placing her hand on his shoulder, drawing him closer. When they finally parted, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. I'm not good with words, Grace. Never have been. But I care for you more than I thought possible to care for anyone again. And I for you, Grace whispered, her heart too full for more elaborate declarations. They remained by the creek until the sun began to set, talking of small things and large, of hopes and fears long held private. When they finally walked back to the ranch, hand in hand, Grace felt as though she were stepping into a new life, one far different from what she had imagined when she first came west, but infinitely more precious. The changes in their relationship did not go unnoticed at the ranch. Hank merely nodded with satisfaction when he saw them return from the creek together, as if a long-expected event had finally occurred. Ben, younger and less perceptive, took longer to notice, but was genuinely pleased when he realized what was happening. About time, Hank commented one evening as he and Vincent worked on saddle repairs in the barn. Thought I might have to knock some sense into you. Vincent's lips twitched in amusement. That obvious, was it? To everyone but you two, seems like. Hank punched a new hole in a leather strap with practiced ease. She's good for you, brings light into this place. Vincent couldn't disagree. Grace had transformed not just the physical spaces of the ranch, making the main house truly a home with small touches that reflected care and attention, but also the emotional landscape. Her presence filled gaps he hadn't realized existed until she began to occupy them. For Grace, the weeks that followed were filled with a happiness she had never expected to find. Vincent was not a demonstrative man in public, but when they were alone, he showed his affection in countless small ways, a touch of his hand at the small of her back, the way his eyes softened when they met hers across a room, The care he took to bring her wildflowers or interesting stones he found while riding the range. Their evenings often ended with long conversations on the porch, sometimes with kisses that grew increasingly difficult to end. Yet Vincent never pressed for more, his respect for her as complete as his affection. It was Grace who finally broached the subject of their future one evening in late August. They were sitting on the porch swing he had built for her, watching as lightning flickered on the distant horizon, promising a storm that might or might not reach them. "Vincent," she began, her heart racing despite her determination to speak calmly. "What are we doing?" He glanced at her, his arm tightening slightly around her shoulders. Watching the lightning, Grace smiled despite her nervousness. "You know what I mean, us, this. Where is it leading?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment, and Grace felt a flutter of anxiety. Had she misread his intentions? "I've been thinking about that," he finally said, his voice low. "About what I want, what I hope you might want too." He shifted to face her more directly, taking both her hands in his. "I love you, Grace. Have for some time now. Been trying to find the right moment, the right words to tell you properly." Joy bloomed in Grace's chest, spreading warmth through her entire being. "I love you too," she whispered. "So much." Vincent's smile was radiant in the gathering dusk. "Then marry me. Be my wife, my partner in everything. Help me build something lasting here." The proposal was simple, direct, utterly Vincent in its straightforwardness. Grace didn't need flowery declarations or dramatic gestures. This quiet offering of his heart, his life, his future was more precious than any elaborate romance. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady despite the tears of happiness that threatened. "Yes, I will marry you." Vincent kissed her then with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the depth of his feelings. When they parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that gleamed in the fading light. "Belonged to my mother," he explained, holding up a delicate ring with a single pearl. "It's not diamonds or anything fancy, it's perfect," Grace interrupted, extending her hand so he could slip the ring onto her finger. "Absolutely perfect." The ring fit as if made for her, the pearl luminous against her skin. Vincent raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers just above where the ring now rested. "When?" he asked. "How soon can I call you my wife?" Grace laughed at his eagerness, feeling lighter than she had in years. "As soon as can be arranged properly. Though I have no family to consider, no complicated preparations needed." 2 weeks, Vincent suggested. "That would give us time to prepare, invite a few friends. Mrs. Holden would never forgive me if we eloped without giving her a chance to fuss over you." 2 weeks, Grace agreed, already imagining their life together not as employer and housekeeper, but as husband and wife. September 1st. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Bozeman when they rode to town the following Saturday. Mrs. Holden was ecstatic, embracing Grace with tears in her eyes. "I knew it," she exclaimed. "From the moment he brought you to the store that first day, I knew you were meant for each other." Mr. Holden shook Vincent's hand vigorously. "About time you settled down, son. And you couldn't have chosen better." The preparations for the wedding were simple but meaningful. Grace sewed a new dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from Mrs. Holden's catalog. Vincent had the cabin thoroughly cleaned and expanded, adding a second room and a proper kitchen so it could serve as their home until he could build something larger. "The main house can be for guests, or for Ben if he stays on," Vincent explained as he showed Grace the improvements. "Thought you might like our own place with a bit more privacy." The consideration touched Grace deeply. "It's perfect," she assured him. "Truly." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the September air carrying the first hint of autumn's approach. The ceremony was held at the ranch, with Reverend Michaels from the Bozeman Church officiating. Mrs. Holden had decorated the main house with late summer wildflowers and ribbons, transforming the simple space into something festive and beautiful. Grace wore her blue silk dress with a crown of white asters in her hair. Vincent, looking somewhat uncomfortable but undeniably handsome in a new suit, waited for her on the porch where they had spent so many evenings together. The guests were few, but dear the Holdens, Lieutenant Davis from Fort Ellis, several neighbors who had become friends, and of course Hank and Ben, looking scrubbed and awkward in their Sunday best. As Grace walked toward Vincent, her heart full to bursting with love and gratitude for the unexpected turn her life had taken, she thought of that day at the depot, her tears, her despair, the uncertain future that had stretched before her. How different everything had become because one man had looked beyond her distress to see her worth, had offered kindness without expectation, had whispered that single word that had changed everything. Stay, and she had. And now she would stay forever, bound to this man and this land by choice and by love. The ceremony was brief, the words traditional yet profound in their simplicity. When Vincent slipped a gold band onto her finger to join her mother's pearl, his hands were steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Michaels declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Vincent's kiss was gentle, mindful of their audience, but his eyes promised more for later when they were alone. The celebration that followed was joyous, a feast prepared by Mrs. Holden and several neighboring women, music provided by a fiddler from town, dancing that lasted well into the evening. As twilight fell, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds to begin their life together. Vincent led Grace to their cabin, now transformed with new curtains at the windows, fresh linens on the enlarged bed, a colorful quilt made by Mrs. Holden as a wedding gift. "Welcome home, Mrs. O'Malley," Vincent said softly as he closed the door behind them. Grace looked up at him, this man who had become everything to her in the span of a few short months. "I love you, Vincent O'Malley," she said simply, "more than I ever thought possible to love anyone." His arms encircled her, drawing her close against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "And I love you, Grace O'Malley. Will spend my life showing you how much." Their kiss was different now, deeper, filled with promise and desire too long held in check. As Vincent's hands moved to the buttons of her dress, Grace felt no fear, only anticipation and the certainty that this was exactly where she belonged. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, the sounds of the Montana night a gentle backdrop to their whispered words of love, Grace traced the contours of Vincent's face with her fingertips. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "That I'm grateful," she replied truthfully. "For Thomas Keller's rejection, for your kindness that day at the depot, for everything that led us here." Vincent pulled her closer. "I knew, you know, the moment I saw you standing there in tears. Knew you were someone special, someone I wanted in my life. Is that why you asked me to stay?" "Partly. Also couldn't bear to see you hurting." He stroked her hair gently. "Never expected to fall in love with you. That part took me by surprise." Grace smiled in the darkness. "A good surprise, I hope. The best." Vincent's voice was husky with emotion. "You've brought light back into my life, Grace. Purpose beyond just surviving." They fell asleep in each other's arms, the first night of many they would share as husband and wife. The years that followed brought changes and challenges, as all years do. The Army contract was fulfilled successfully, bringing financial security that allowed Vincent to expand the ranch and improve their living conditions. The cabin was eventually replaced by a proper house, though they kept the original structure as a reminder of their beginnings. Children came first: a son, Harrison James, named for both their fathers, then twin daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who inherited their mother's chestnut hair and their father's storm-gray eyes. The sound of children's laughter became as much a part of the ranch as the whinnying of horses and the rustling of prairie grasses. Hank remained with them, becoming an honorary uncle to the children and Vincent's trusted right hand in all ranch matters. Ben eventually left to start his own place, but visited often, bringing his wife and later their children to play with the O'Malley brood. Through it all, Vincent and Grace's love deepened, weathering the inevitable storms of life with the same strength and resilience that had brought them together. They built a life rich in meaning, if not always in material wealth. Their partnership, a source of admiration among neighbors and friends. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Vincent surprised Grace with a journey east to visit Philadelphia and Boston, places from their past, now transformed by the passage of time and their changed perspectives. "Wanted you to see where I came from," Vincent explained as they stood before the grand house that had once been his family home, now belonging to strangers. "And to know that home is wherever you are, not in buildings or places." In Boston, they visited Grace's parents' graves, Vincent standing solid beside her as she placed flowers and shed a few tears for the family she had lost. But there were smiles, too, as she showed him places from her youth, sharing stories of happier times. "Glad we came?" Vincent asked as they prepared to return west. Grace nodded, slipping her hand into his. "Yes, but gladder still to be going home. Home to Montana, to their children waiting in the care of Mrs. Holden and Hank, to the life they had built together from an unexpected beginning at a train depot where a tearful mail-order bride had found kindness from a taciturn cowboy who had simply asked her to stay. And she had stayed, for always.